Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly 90-minute deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Dave. I'm a parent of a daughter in college, and we live in Chicago, Illinois.
My name is Lisa. I'm a clinical psychologist and a college counselor. I am a parent of a boy in elementary school, a girl in middle school, and a girl in college. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University.
This week in the news, a new push to create a 3-year degree option by Emma Whitford of the Wall Street Journal. This week, Mark will discuss what changes do you foresee in college admissions over the next 3 years. That will be part 3 of 4. Our interview is with Michael Ireland, the Assistant Director of Financial Aid at Smith College, and Courtney Blauvett, a former financial aid officer at 4 colleges and the Director of College Counseling at the Miss Hall School. And they will be answering 12 questions our listeners sent in about financial aid and paying for college. And that will be part 3 of 5. And our college spotlight comes to you via Kevin Newton, and he's discussing University College London.
And friends, my one announcement I want to make is just feel for anyone who's hearing back from colleges and not getting in the places they'd hoped to get in. And I just want to say that I know it stings. I know it hurts. You're talking to 2 people here that have been rejected. Dave
Johns Hopkins.
Yes. And the University of Michigan is now in the Final Four, adding insult to injury for me.
That's right.
I never asked Lisa if she didn't get anything. She's one of these super smart, brilliant people that probably got in everywhere. But hey,
Yeah.
you know,
My excuse is I was applying to an imaginary college anyway, so there you go.
but I think we turned out okay. Our egos are bruised, but we'll survive. And so it kind of does work out. Time tends to heal things, and there's just so many people, so many people who have ended up at a school that they like so much more than the original school that they thought they were going to like. So just stay positive, and good things will happen.
Absolutely. Life moves on, and in a couple of years' time, this will seem such an irrelevant time in your life.
As they say, this too shall pass.
Absolutely.
All right, friends. Our admissions tip has to do with interviews, and I learned something every year from all of my students, and this year is no exception. I do interview prep with my students, and then I like to follow up with them and ask how the interviews went. And one thing that I'm noticing this year is that interviewees are asking more COVID questions. So my tip is prepare for the COVID questions. Well, what are the COVID questions? How has the pandemic impacted your life? Have you done anything different as a result of COVID that you wouldn't have done? And it can go into any opportunities, activities, involvements, things you were deprived of. Did you take advantage? How did you take advantage of this time to do anything creative? I mean, there's a lot of series of questions that can be asked, but just do a little brainstorming and think about how you might answer some specific questions related to COVID, because it's not happening in most interviews, but it's happened to more than one of my students. So that's my admissions tip for the week. And for admissions vernacular, the word is stopped out.
Wow. I know what stopped out means. We won't tell you.
It's an
how I
inside
know
joke
it
Dave and
means.
I have.
It means when you quit college, or you don't quit college, you decide just to withdraw, probably temporarily, but you reserve the option to return at your convenience or later at a certain other time. So
You nailed it. So it's actually a pretty formal term. Some of the terms we throw around are just lingo, slang. If 25 schools use it. This one, if you Google stopped out college, you'll see like several Google page articles. You have to go back to the second, third, fourth page on Google to see all the articles about stopping out. I find term is used more frequently with under-resourced students that are struggling to stay in college, although it's not exclusively used there. But that's where I hear that term used, more than anywhere else. All right, our big numbers. So a couple weeks ago, my big number was 4,000, and it was North Carolina State. They were adding 4,000 computer science and engineering students over the next 5 years, 2,000 in grad and 2,000 undergrad, and they got $50 million to do it because the Research Triangle needs to have more talent. And that's the engineering computer science school for the state. So now North Carolina's back again with another initiative. So the big number is 97 million. What is 97 million? 97 million is the amount of money that North Carolina is investing in its 16 public campuses to expand online programs to all 16 campuses. They're targeting the non-traditional student, and they're adding 120 new academic programs, and their goal is to enroll 24,000 new students by 27. And they're calling it Project Kitty Hawk. What do you think that stands for, Dave? Kitty Hawk.
That's the launching place for the Wright brothers when they first flew that airplane.
Exactly, and it's outside the Outer Banks. It's a small little North Carolina town called Kitty Hawk. That's where that all went down, so that's what they're naming it. And what they're trying to do, they've done some research, and they've noticed that a lot of North Carolina students are taking these online programs from out-of-state schools. They particularly found Strayer and Liberty. There are two that I mentioned a few weeks ago, and I gave you guys a list of some of the more popular online programs, are draining a lot of the talent out of state and putting people in a lot of debt. And so they're trying to do it with a real affordable option. And believe it or not, any idea where the $97 million came from for this, Dave?
Donations?
Some pandemic relief fund.
Oh,
they tapped the pandemic relief fund for the $97 million. So good for North Carolina for being creative. And you go, all 16 schools now. And I always like to hear they're targeting non-traditional students. So that always makes me happy. So that's our big number of the day. I realize we have to be so careful talking about the virus because as soon as you share something, your perspective is outdated by time. Recently I asked you to talk about Omicron, and you made it sound like, hunky-dory, no big deal. And then, a week later, here we are in a bit of a real quagmire. So let's talk about it, Dave. What are your thoughts? This is not our article of the day, but it's Dave and I talked. There was an article we were going to talk about on Cornell having this big outbreak, but then Middlebury closed down, and then NYU and Princeton and all these schools, it started spreading like crazy. And then the NFL is having more outbreaks in the last week than they had the whole season. And so instead of just making a whole article, we said we'll just talk about it. And you kind of get two articles today from us, bonus content now, and then we have another article. So what are your thoughts, Dave?
My thoughts is an illustration in my mind, that classic illustration of a snowball that starts at the size of maybe a baseball at the top of the hill. And we're just at the point where it's gaining speed and that snowball is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the problem is we don't know how long the hill is, when the bottom is, and how big that snowball is going to get. In fact, I think 2 days ago when we first talked about Cornell, I believed it was 900 kids. So I was even surprised when he said it's 1,100, but not really.
Yeah, I heard that this morning.
That's right, because this new Omicron variant is doubling every 2 to 3 days. So it is literally, it's on that exponential, near vertical slope of the curve. And we just don't know much about it yet. We are hopeful that there are some theories that it borrowed its genetic material from the common cold virus, which makes it far, far more transmissible, up to 4 or 5 times more transmissible than Delta, but much less lethal and less hospitalizations. So most of the symptoms have been mild. However, most of the symptoms have also been in people that have already been double vaccinated, some even with boosters. So the thought is that, even if the symptoms are much milder, if it's that much more infectious, the denominator of this is going to be so large that even if it's a relatively smaller numerator, that's a whole lot of people, unvaccinated and vaccinated, that could get potentially hospitalized and sick. And the problem is that we're still in the Delta surge. So we're getting a double bubble effect. That if this snowball increases the way we think, we should be getting Omicron hitting probably sometime in the first or second week in January, while we're still haven't peaked out on the Delta surge. And right now, I can tell you, I'm walking into the emergency room every night, and probably about 50-60% of the admission cases are already Delta. And we haven't maxed out our ICUs, but we're getting close. So, very concerning. And now, the last thing I want for my daughter, and I know for a lot of kids, because we're also psychologically burnt out, is to almost turn the emotional clock back and tell these kids who have just already had their college education so compromised that they can't go back to school in January, or that they have to go back online. So we don't know where this thing is going to end, but to say that it's psychologically unsettling is probably a massive understatement. So,
Yeah, no, Dave, I heard this morning that Cornell's 97% vaccinated.
right.
So the overwhelming number of these 1,100 cases are with people that are not only vaccinated but have been boosted as well. Now, the good news is so far, from what I've seen, there's not serious hospitalization so far, or increased death rates, but you're a transmitter, and it probably presents the greatest risk for people that haven't been vaccinated or boosted. You're a transmitter.
And I want to emphasize that point. I mean, even if you have been vaccinated, and even if you're asymptomatic, they're saying that the average infected person with Omicron is passing the virus on to 5 or 6 people. Now, I am assuaged by the fact that they found that if you've only had 2 shots of the Pfizer or Moderna, then your immunity goes down to like 33%. But after the booster, your immunity to hospitalization and severe disease goes back up over 90%. So even though you're going to get the virus, it's probably going to be very, very mild. However, the fact is, right now, only 17% of our population has had the booster, and we still have a good 20% of the adult population who is unvaccinated. So we have a huge reservoir of potential badness out there if this Omicron continues to spread the way it's spreading.
Well, there's that component, but then there's also the component of institutions shutting down. Now, how much of them shutting down had to do with the fact that they're about to go on Christmas break in a week anyway? So, the timing is good. Let's just cut it down a week earlier. Let's go to online exams. Some of them have gone to strictly online exams. I don't have an answer to that. I don't know if they would have done this if people have just been back for a month. What are your thoughts?
I think there's going to be 2 levels. I think the good news is that the institutions have been through this before and they have structures in place. So there's one thing where the students stay on campus, but they just shift their learning online. So it's not that difficult now for Cornell and Princeton and so forth to say, no, stay in your dorms, but load up your computers, and now your final exams will be proctored online and you'll do it online. So I think most universities have those structures already in place. So that's number one. And hopefully, if the kids can stay on campus, then they have that ability to ride out the storm, so to speak, for the next 2 months and maybe reevaluate. Because what I'm hoping is that with Omicron being so infectious that it's a tall but narrow spike, so to speak. It's like a tsunami that washes over us. We're already seeing evidence in South Africa where the cases seem to have peaked and may be declining. So there's a possibility that the worst of this may be over in maybe February. And if that's the case, they might only have to have momentary disruptions and then resume. So that's my hope. The second thing, though, is which I hope doesn't happen, is that they decide to send kids home, like they did in the first wave. And then I think that would be devastating. So the first, I think, would be an inconvenience, but one that would be temporary. And the second, I think, would be, and less likely, I hope, would be where they actually shut down the campus itself and send the kids home. And I hope we don't get to that point.
No, I agree. And here's my concern. I mean, in a period of a day or two, and probably by, the end of the day today, there will be so many more than this. I mean, Dave and I are sitting here recording this on December 16th. And so this doesn't actually go live until a week from today, the 23rd. So who knows where things will be at by the time our listeners hear this.
When we say that at the time of this recording, we are literally going on an hour-by-hour update basis, that is so much the case.
Yeah, and this is my concern. I'm thinking of our listeners and focusing on them. And we know from the research that it might be 190 now, last I checked, that have completed our questionnaire. 29.6 of you have a student in college, and 90% have a student in high school. So let's say you're a parent of a high school student, but you're also a parent of a college student. And so you've been through this already once before, and you saw the inferior quality of education that your child received, and you still were stuck with the same sticker price for the most part, unless you came home, then you didn't have the room and board, but the tuition didn't have an adjustment, and you got 20-cent education on it, and you had to pay $1 for it. And so what ramifications do all these shutdowns have right now on rising seniors, even rising juniors? And I'll tell you something, Dave, I had a sophomore parent about maybe a week or two ago say to me, we were talking about schools and locations, and I was recommending some schools that matched really well with their profile, but they were, pretty far away. And the parent said, well, we don't know what's going to be going on with COVID, so I think we're probably going to be more likely to want to stay close to home. And at the time I said, well, you're a sophomore, your kid's a sophomore, so that's a couple years away. But now that doesn't seem so unrealistic that for someone to think that way. But the point is, this impacts the psyche of the senior, the parent of a senior, the parent of a junior, and the parent of a sophomore that's now wondering, is school going to be closed down and is this going to be online again? And if you're a parent that's also had a college student, this is not your first rodeo. And you didn't like the first one very much. And so this can have real ramifications for where students choose to go to school. Do they gap year, or are they going to stay closer to home and not, have to deal with flights and all this stuff? And so it's very real. It's very real.
Yeah, and I feel for all those kids, all those high school students who are superstars in so many extracurricular activities that are negatively affected. I mean, if you're on a debating team, if you're on a sports athletic teams, if you're on any type of travel team, science conferences, all these things got shut down on the first wave. And so these kids had to apply to college, missing a vital part of their strength in their applications through no fault of their own. And so I know a lot of kids right now are probably really stressing out. Am I going to be able to attend the tournaments and the different programs that is so much reflective of my interests and strengths? But if they shut that down, it's just going to adversely impact the nature of my application. So I'm not saying that's going to happen, but everything's back on the table with this Omicron. So it's very stressful.
All right, Dave, we got in with the positive. Yeah. So what's the positive? Because I'm always believing giving people hope, and I feel that we've been pretty dour in this conversation. I mean, we're trying to keep it real.
The positive, I think, is going to be a quick wave. Anytime you have there's two sides to any coin. Anytime you have an agent that's this infectious, that acts this quickly, the peak is very steep, but it's narrow and fast. And I think the preliminary data is hopeful that whatever this is with Omicron, that we should be over this wave in the next maybe 2 months, maybe shorter. So I'm hoping that we can stick it out with minimal disruption, get as many people vaccinated as possible. And the other big positive is that Pfizer confirmed that their new COVID pill is 97% effective against Omicron. And this is a pill that even after you get it, if you get symptomatic, that it will keep people from being hospitalized in severe disease over 90%. So that's a huge game changer. I am optimistic that the FDA will fast track that approval, and we should have that in the mix hopefully by January and February. So as bad as this is, I don't think it's going to be as bad as the first wave, and I think by February and March we're going to be looking at this in the rear view mirror. So let's not get too stressed out. Let's deal with what we have to deal with on a daily basis, and I think we will get through this.
There we go. I like that as a word. Now I'm going to try to venture in a place that I have no business going, and that is a movie reference, and I know I'm going to fumble and bumble it. Wasn't there some movie? Yeah. I'm going to need you to clean it up, my friend.
I know.
Wasn't there some movie like Freddy or somebody like that where somebody, like one of those scary movies where something had like 9 lives and they wouldn't die and they kept coming back?
Now, people are just dropping the mic on your podcast here, man. That's Halloween. Fred.
Okay.
Probably the most iconic
is it called Friday the 13th? No? So is that something like that? I don't know.
It's Friday the 13th. Yeah, that's like saying, wasn't there some movie about a space adventure and this guy who thought he was a Jedi Knight? What was that called?
Jaws! And I'm like, Jaws.
Yeah, we got you, man. We know about Freddy.
Okay. That's how I'm feeling. That's how I'm feeling about the virus, man. It's just not going away. It keeps coming back. Friends, I'm coming to you from Canada right now. I'm here for my niece's wedding, but fortunately, I brought my podcast equipment, except for the recording sound booth. And no, I am not under the covers. When you have a section called In the News, you have to be prepared for news to break. That happened already with all the colleges closing early or going to online exams, and Dave and I recorded that after our original recording. But 2 days ago, Harvard announced it was going test optional through 2026 or for the next 4 admission cycles. This is significant on a number of levels. I've had conversations with William Fitzsimmons, Harvard's congenial and venerated admissions dean who has been at Harvard for 50 years. Harvard has traditionally found great value to tests. They were one of the last schools to abandon strongly encouraging their students to submit SAT subject tests, which are now obsolete. Fitzsimmons and David Coleman of the SAT have as close a relationship as you'll find. David Coleman is the 9th president of the College Board and has been in that role since 2012. Coleman has always understood the power of Harvard, and he tends to bounce initiatives off Fitzsimmons and Harvard before moving forward to get their buy-in. So why would Harvard do this? Well, their stated reason is complications created by the pandemic. But you have to be a little naive to believe this is the entire reason. If it was only the pandemic, why not extend the test optional policy for 1 more year? Why 4 years? Well, several things are clear. As colleges get used to reading applications without test scores, they no longer feel they need test scores. Test scores make them dependent on an outside agency, the College Board. And we know test scores are highly controversial because, 1, the multi-billion-dollar test prep industry is something colleges despise. Secondly, the almost unique way test scores add stress to already stressed out teenagers' lives. And the disturbing correlation between test scores and parent income and parent education. Harvard knows they can look at grades in courses like BC Calc, Physics C, AP Chem, AP Lang, AP Lit, World History, etc. And for those who have their own advanced curriculum or use the IB or one of the other competitor curriculums, they can just substitute test scores for high grades in the most advanced courses. And they can also look at scores on AP tests when they're available. They also know that some high schools provide a ranking, and better yet, some even provide a grade distribution, and colleges can get almost everything test scores gave them without the hassle and the biases test scores bring to their readers. Because they also know test scores can also bias readers in some significant ways. It is extremely rare for me to talk to an admission officer who reads files in a test optional environment who wants to go back to mandatory test scores. It is clear that Harvard wants to do a 6-year experiment. They were already test optional for the high school class of 2021 and 2022, but now they are extending this through the class of 2023, 2024, 2025, and 2026. That would be the college classes of 2027, 2028, 2029, and 2030. This will give them 6 years of data. It is clear that the torrent of apps they get when they go test optional and how they are able to use these extra apps can help them shape their class. Harvard's early action acceptance rate, not their regular rate, their early action acceptance rate for the class of 2026, that's the current seniors, just came in and it was under 8%. With almost 10,000 single-choice early action apps. It was their second most selective class ever. They like this. It is also very significant that they chose to go test optional and not test blind, or some prefer test free or score free, like schools like Dickinson the UCs and others did. Here's a quote from Fitz, as he's affectionately known, William Fitzsimmons, Harvard's esteemed Dean of Admission. Students who do not submit test scores will not be disadvantaged in their application process. Students can submit whatever materials they believe would convey their accomplishments in secondary school and their promise for the future. Now, some are going to argue that Harvard is going on offense in light of the looming Supreme Court case they have been embroiled in now since 2018. Harvard's use of test scores has also been part of the lawsuit accusing it of discriminating against Asian American applicants by holding them to a higher standard than other prospective students. The lawsuit said that as a group, Asian American applicants scored higher than others on measures like standardized tests, but they were penalized by a subjective personal rating. And a federal court and an appeals court have upheld Harvard's admissions process, finding that it was not discriminatory. But the Supreme Court is now considering whether to hear the case. So why is this so significant? Well, Harvard on the East Coast and University of California UCs on the West Coast shape decisions in highly selective higher ed as much as anyone. One public school system, one private school, one East Coast, one West Coast, with both not requiring scores now for years. It will have a cascade effect. Now, it's been clear the liberal arts and sciences schools, as I like to call them, would remain test optional. Remember when Sam Prouty of Middlebury was on the podcast? I shared with you what Sam said to me privately, and he told me that I could share with you all publicly. I asked Sam if this great experiment that schools like Middlebury are doing, where they're attempting to read files without test scores for a year or two, if they would return to test scores and would begin requiring them. What did Prouty say? He said, "Do you remember the old rotary phone that you used to see in phone booths?" He said, "Do you think we're ever going back to that?" Well, that's where scores are headed. Prouty's proving to be prophetic. So where do I see scores headed? Well, we're in a big phase of big experimentation over the next 3 to 5 years. Look at what Cornell is doing. They are literally test blind or test free for their School of Agriculture and Life Sciences, for the School of Art and Planning, for the Dyson School of Business, and for the School of Architecture. But they're test optional for Human Ecology, Arts and Sciences, ILR, which is Industrial Labor Relations, and Engineering. Talk about experimentation. Test scores are on life support with private schools in terms of being required. It is awfully hard as an admission officer to answer the question, if Harvard and Cal Berkeley and UCLA don't need test scores, why do you need them? Of course, admission officers are not the only ones making these decisions. They not have any real input when it comes to governors' boards and state public institutions. So watch the big, large public systems in the South and the Midwest in particular. Georgia and Florida are requiring them for current seniors in a pandemic. No West Coast public systems like Oregon, Washington, or California currently are requiring scores. So this could end up being a regional test as far as scores being mandatory. That's certainly possible. There's no question that where you are most likely to see test scores continue to be mandatory is with the public schools, the flagships, and the regional publics. The pandemic is still being around, is going to impact 2023. And once you have 3 years in a row of not requiring the test, it's going to be really hard to reverse this and go back to requiring the tests. Well, Stuck, you just gave it as one of your 15 trends to look for more creative alternatives besides tests being mandatory and test optional and blind. Do you still stand by that? I still think we're going to see a lot of creativity like you're seeing with Cornell, but the pandemic is just not going away, and it's now impacting the class of 2023. This Harvard decision has caused me to mollify my view a little. I'm not sure if I would have made one of my 15 trends expect to see a lot of requirements for the test in creative ways. I debated in my head including another trend, which was the continued growth of early decision. and the creative attempts schools are using to lock students in to increase their yield. So to be honest, I probably would have either gone with that trend or I would have reworded my test point differently. I would have said something like this: expect more disruption when it comes to test score policies. I think Harvard's decision puts a lot of pressure on Yale, which has clearly signaled that it finds significant value to having students submitting test scores. Will Yale follow Georgetown and require the test and almost be out on an island in the selective private schools? I would find that to be a little surprising. I think the most likely scenario is that all the Ivy League schools are test optional through 2023. And this will impact schools like Duke, Northwestern, and others who compete with the Ivies. Pay attention to whether they just announce for 2023 or if they make a multi-year commitment like we've seen with the UCLAs, the Cal Berkeleys, and the Harvards. And pay attention to whether they go test optional like Harvard has done or test blind like 4 of the Cornell schools have gone. A 1-year commitment implies it was done a little begrudgingly, possibly linking it to the pandemic. MIT is another school that has found great values to scores, but they also like getting a lot more apps, especially from non-traditional students. So more than anyone, I'm watching MIT and Yale in particular to see what they announce when it comes to scores. I'm increasingly starting to think that Charlie Deacon, the 30-year dean of admissions at Georgetown, are going to be out on an island as the only highly selective private school requiring test scores for 2023. One thing's for sure, this is an ever-changing story, and you can look forward to your college-bound kid in the news to bring you updates if they unfold, even if I have to do a monologue over Christmas from Canada.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
Dave, we got an exciting article. Take it away, my friend.
It is a new push to create a 3-year degree option by Emma Whitford of the Wall Street Journal. This article talks about a pilot program called the Degree in 3 that is being spearheaded by Robert Zemsky, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and Lori Carell, a professor at the University of Minnesota at Rochester. And they have recruited more than a dozen institutions to explore the concept of a 3-year bachelor's degree. But the goal of this program is not just to pack 120 credit hours, the standard time to get your degree in 4 years, into 3, but to totally overhaul the curriculum that's needed to learn the skills and materials for a bachelor's degree from 4 years' time into 3 years' time. And they've recruited such schools such as Merrimack College, Portland State University, University of Minnesota at Rochester, and University of North Texas, among others, to this goal. So the question is, why would they want to do this? What's the driving incentive? And it comes down to one major thing: cost. From 1980 to 2020, the share of education costs that students and families are paying towards college rose from 21% in 1980 to 44% in 2020. And last year, the tuition rose. Over the last 30 years, the tuition at public colleges rose $6,500 in public universities and $18,700 in private institutions.
And that's adjusted for inflation, by the way, too.
That's correct. So the concept is, if you can reduce the education for 4 years to 3 years, you can theoretically save 25% of a student's costs. But past attempts, and there have been many past attempts at this concept, have failed. So the question is why? And the question's answered by the experience of Albertus Magnus College in Connecticut, who tried this program and found, quote, a 3-year time frame did not allow for the psychosocial and academic development of 18 to 22-year-olds that often occurs in 4 years. And they found that many students could just could not cope with the heavier course loads and the faster pace of doing 4 years in 3. And in fact, the University of Iowa, who currently has a Degree in 3 program, admitted that a 3-year degree is not for everyone. It's designed for students with specific goals, who have some college credits coming into college, and who are able to complete more courses per term than the average student. That's why a report in 2017 by the Hanover Research Group found that few students that enroll in these three-year degree programs actually complete it. So the College in 3 project is going to attempt to sidestep some of these pitfalls, and the question is how. And it is by, quote, designing a 3-year program that matches the slower pace of a 4-year program so that students will hopefully avoid the burnout, and it will allow the students to take advantage of the other opportunities on campus, such as athletics and student activities that previous 3-year programs did not. Despite the optimism for this new program, they face quite a few hurdles. The accrediting agencies and the U.S. Department of Education has not entirely bought into the concept, and many critics still feel that there is diminished psychosocial benefits of doing college in 3 years, and it does not allow a typical student the 4 years that they usually need to mature in many ways. But the proponents of this project still feel that there is going to be a type of student that will be very much attracted to this, maybe older students, maybe non-traditional students, but definitely cost-oriented students that are often vocationally oriented and would be very attracted to the idea of completing 4 years in 3. So with that summary, Mark, I throw it open to you and say, what say you?
Yeah, I mean, I like this article a lot, and it explores the history of looking at these other 3-year programs, and there's been a lot. It's been tried a lot, and it's been fairly unsuccessful in the past. And of course, there's always been people that have crammed by taking 18, 20 credit hours a semester, going through the summers, coming in with lots of AP credits or CLEP credits or IB credits, foregoing work opportunities, and, just going through the summers. And so there's always been people that have done that. The question is the timing right for something like this? The cost of college has reached a tipping point where people have said enough. And so in one sense, there could be a sector of the population where the idea of going for 3 years could be really appealing from a financial standpoint. Lamar Alexander, that's right, the same Lamar Alexander, just retired from the Senate, used to be president of University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and had a lot of big concern for education for some time. He likened it to, I'll read what it says here. Lamar Alexander pushed the idea in 2009, calling it the 3-year bachelor degree. He said the higher ed equivalent of a fuel-efficient car compared to gas-guzzling 4-year course. And so others have tried. Richard Celeste, former governor of Ohio, former president of Colorado College, had tried. So had Richard Vedder, professor emeritus of economics at Ohio University, and the late George Keller, professor at University of Pennsylvania. Many people have tried. Why is it that it hasn't caught on? What would make it different? Have we reached the point where cost is of such a concern? And it's not just the $40,000. I'm just throwing that number out that you'd save during the year in college. You have to look at the opportunity cost. What if you would make $60,000 your first year out? So then it's a $100,000 swing. Is that the difference between what you would make? You're making 60 instead of paying 40. Or maybe you're paying 60, so it's a 120 swing. So is that enough? Well, my sense is for some students, I think it could be really appealing. And I think some of those students could be a number of people. They could be non-traditional students that are living at home and want to just get this thing out as soon as possible. It could be students, very cost-sensitive students. And it just could be some incredibly career-focused students, because one of the programs they're talking about involves increased internships and more real-world experience so that you come out ready to transition into the workforce. So my thinking is, if they had all the students live together, if they were residential students, and put them all like in a living learning community, I think that kind of support would be important, because there are a lot of obstacles built in place. And you've commented on some of them, Dave. The accreditation process, that's not going to be easy. It's traditionally been 120 credits. And then one the article talks about is big-time sports. Sports is not set up for this system. So I don't see this as something that's going to replace the 4-year degree, but it could be something I think if done right could provide a nice alternative for a cohort of students. What do you think, Dave?
I agree. Clearly, a student has to have certain advantages to take advantage of this. I think they have to come into college very well prepared. I think they have to be focused. They obviously have to have the financial means during those 3 years to devote entirely to study because they won't have work study options. But for those that maybe want to go to medical school and they realize that they're looking at 10 plus years of training, to shave off a year could be very attractive. For those that have very specific vocations they want to do, or technical trades such as computer science, or they're entrepreneurial, and so they just want to get the degree to pursue other things, I think that could be attractive. But I think overall we're still looking at probably less than 10 to 15% of students that would really match all the boxes to fully take advantage of a degree program. So it's specialized, but it's not going to be the norm.
Friends, this is the end of part 1. Next week we will resume with part 2 of the same article.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Friends, the last 2 weeks we covered admissions trends over the next 5 years or so. We will now resume that discussion with part 3 of 4. The next point is also a money one. This is a good trend, and I'm kind of excited to talk about this. So it's more transparency in aid awards. So schools are feeling pressure, and this is one area where I feel they should feel pressure to have consistent aid awards. They're doing workshops and seminars and letting people know about their new aid plans, and this is what they're doing. And, I for my recommended resource last week, I did Ron Lieber's book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of it comes from that. I really do, because that book really, resonated in the marketplace. And he really underscored what College of Wooster did. It was a whole chapter he had on it, if I remember. On this College of Wooster now is it's completely letting you know ahead of time what you have to pay before you commit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just Wooster, this is spreading. So there's other schools that are doing this. Trinity University is doing this. Hobart, William and Smith is doing this. Whitman just announced that they're doing this. And I was on a workshop with Willamette this week, and I'm speaking out about this every time I can, because you can make change. And I'm saying this to parents. You can make change when you ask these schools about this kind of thing in information sessions, and especially when their competitors are doing it. And so we broke up at individual sessions with financial aid people, and I asked this. I talked, I'm seeing more and more schools are doing this. Where are you guys at with this? And then they said, well, Whitman just announced this year. That's probably their biggest competitor. And then somebody else in another breakout session asked the same thing. And then we came together for our group session. There's a bunch of college counselors around the country. And it came up again in there. And there's a lot of schools. And here's the thing. It's really hard for a school to say they can't do it when schools that aren't as wealthy as them are doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Because it does take, like this comes up in ask a question to Michael about this, Michael Ireland, because this comes up when one of the listeners sent something in on this. So you'll hear that conversation. But, it does take a lot more staff. Like it would require them taking some of that money and hiring more financial aid staff, because they're going to have to look at full tax returns. They're going to have to go way beyond what any net price calculator does to give you an accurate aid report. But my point always has been, what a boon that can be to your marketing. I mean, Wooster is getting so much bang for their buck by making this decision. And Franklin and Marshall has done this for a long time for early decision applicants. You get usually they call it an early estimate. There's different terms out there. But you get an actual read where they go over everything and say, this is how much you'll have to pay. And I think it's going to get to the point where the market's going to demand this.
Yeah, I certainly hope it does. I just can't think of any other industry. I'm trying to think of another industry. Well, you want to go on this trip, it'll gonna cost you somewhere between $2,000 and $20,000. And we'll let you know right before you leave. That's just like, it's a crazy thing that colleges have done this. So I really do think they need to move it back and either tell people before or right after so they can make decisions, that work for their families.
Well, the weird thing, Lisa, in some ways, schools are like a bureaucracy and they're like a big giant Titanic boat and they don't move that quickly. But then sometimes I see stuff happen that are accelerants and things can change fast. I mean, obviously one example right now is the whole test optional movement, right? Look how fast that spread. But there's lots of other examples. I mean, it was only 5 years ago that Colby College came out and said that they were going to allow self-reporting of test scores. And then that just spread super fast. Everyone else says, yeah, why am I making you have to go on and pay money to the SAT, to the College Board or the ACT to send scores off to a dozen schools when you're only going to one of them?
Right.
And that thing spread super fast. So schools are kind of weird. Like in one sense, people are in their own silo and you're functioning very independently. But in another sense, everybody's kind of watching their back about what all their competitors are doing as well.
Well, yeah, and I think you have to. And I think there's so much confusion, about people having aid letters. I mean, I'm on the Facebook group Paying for College. And, people are posting these letters and like, I don't understand what this means. And everyone's kind of puzzling over it. And even though like I've probably seen more letters than your average person, I'm still sitting like, well, I think that's a loan. They're not clear. And I just think being really transparent, they have to figure all the offers out for people that they're going to admit at some point anyway. Why not do it sooner?
Yeah. You may remember we did in the news on a major study that New America did when they teamed up with You Aspire, and they looked at thousands of aid awards, and there were like over 100 different terms used to refer to like Parent Plus loans. So, no, obviously that's very confusing,
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about this is schools have been able to get away with this partly just because everybody did it. But as soon as you ask, and are you going to let me know exactly what I have to pay before I decide to apply? Or even if it's ED,
Mm-hmm.
like so and so and so and so and so and so is doing it. So I think that this is going to accelerate and accelerate fast. And I'm encouraging everybody to ask schools. Sorry, Michael. Michael's probably not happy with me right now because this is more work for the financial aid office. But you know what? Then they need to hire the staff, right? Hire the
Right.
staff.
Well, especially
Because
for
I don't
early
think it's
decision.
excusable. No, especially for early decisions.
That's just like commit to me and then you're going to be bound to me. But like, I'm going to decide how much you're going to pay, but I'm not going to tell you that to a few months after that. So enjoy. That's not a very comfortable position for families, I don't think.
Especially when schools don't stand behind their net price calculators.
Right. There's that. Well, I'm sorry. I guess it was wrong. Well, that's not very helpful for a family that's uncommitted to that school.
Yeah, so believe it, you can affect change. Like ask schools. You can, you have to be respectful. I was reading about College of Worcester and Whitman. You can mention some other schools. They're going to actually, is that something you're going to do? It's very, very indefensible. It's very difficult to make the case. Well, no, we're not going to do that. You're just going to have to trust us when peer schools are doing it, and especially when those peer schools are not as wealthy.
Yeah.
So look for that. And it's interesting because I've really been researching this a lot just in the last couple of weeks. And I'm really seeing a lot of movement. And when this other counselors from Western State brought it up, she said, I'm really starting to see this movement. So it's not just me. Because first I was like, am I imagining this? And then it's like, no, I'm seeing a lot of things shaking up out there. So anyway, I think we beat that one up enough.
Okay.
Next one, growth of mergers. And so you're seeing this, like, one of the famous ones that people, hear about is Mills and Northeastern merging. One that just went down this year is the Pacific Northwest College of Art. They did a very unique merger where they're merging with multiple colleges. Reed College is one of them. Willamette has the Salem campus, but they also have the Portland campus. And so they merged with them. And I'm seeing this with art schools more and more art schools, smaller schools, women's colleges, and in more demographically threatened areas as well. There's a big merger going on right now in Pennsylvania amongst some public schools. So the growth of mergers is the next one. What do we have next? You have the list up or not?
I do. It's schools changing how they share test scores.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. As more and more schools get test optional, and in literally last year, like 44% of students submitted test scores. So more did not submit than submitted. It's causing some schools to really make some tough decisions, because when you present a profile of your test scores and it's only based off 44% of test takers, some people might think, well, it makes your school look like you have these really high test scores, and that's good. Well, it kind of does, but it also intimidates people.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm seeing a lot of different things out here. Some schools are doing what the FISC guide recently said, which is we're not publishing test scores on our profiles anymore because it's not accurate if it's based on less than half of the students. Some schools are presenting a 3-year average now, and that kind of works now because it takes the pre-pandemic into consideration. And then I know Lee Coffin at Dartmouth said they're not producing it. Like when you see the class profile, and I've noticed that because I'm always looking at class profiles. And it's weird for me to see class profiles that don't have any test scores in them. So I'm seeing everything from we're not reporting it to we're doing a rolling average into a lot of different creative things. And it kind of makes sense because, in the past, if 90% of people submitted the test, then yeah, you could submit that, or 100 even. But if it's literally 44, or in some cases even less, it's kind of a little bit of false advertising to say these are the test scores for our kids, right?
Right.
Any thoughts on that one, Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard. And it makes it harder for people to decide whether to submit or not, too, I guess. If they're not reporting it at all, then you can't, sort of look and see, well, is this in their range or this isn't? But I also understand they don't want to present an overly inflated metric for students that is going to scare people off.
I mean, I think this is actually a really good one because it's sort of like truth in advertising, right? And I think any time you do something that's truth in advertising, then I always respect that. I always have a lot of respect for that. And so I think this is actually a positive thing. And I think it's great that colleges are trying, if they are either not reporting scores or if they're going to report them in a way that's more accurate. Now, if you want to just go with the traditional middle 50%, 25th to 75th percentile, I'm okay with that as long as pretty boldly you demonstrate the percentage of people that actually submitted scores. So I don't have any problem with you using the traditional way as long as you say only half, use your data and say only half of the people submitted scores. And who's kidding you who? It's usually the ones that did better on the test. I'm okay with that. And some people are doing that as well. All right. You want to keep it moving?
Okay. So the next one is how test optional is raising the test score bar.
Yeah. And this is obviously it's a natural implication from what we just discussed, right? And so I'll share a few school stats. I mentioned this in the college spotlight on Rensselaer a few weeks ago. They saw their average test scores go from a 1399 to a 1469. That's a 70-point jump. UPenn saw their middle 50% go from a 1470 to a 1530 to a 1500 to a 1560. And Boston College saw a 98% increase from a 1397 to a 1495. And I did a session with Roanoke College probably about 3 weeks ago, and they said we used to see some kids with good grades that would have like a 900 something test score. We don't see that anymore. If people don't have a 1300, they're not sending it in. And so this is kind of really interesting because it raises a dilemma, and that is, the whole cardinal rule was to only submit scores if your scores are at the median or above, unless you have some unique institutional priority, that makes you a hooked applicant. But is that based off old numbers or new numbers? If it's based off new numbers, for some of these schools, that's pretty insane. Let's take UPenn. UPenn's median ACT was a 35 last year. It's really hard telling a kid who got a 33 or a 34 to go test optional.
Yeah.
Especially if they paid a lot for test prep or worked, even if they didn't pay a lot, if they just worked their buns off on their own. And this is one, Lisa, I'm still getting more clarity on. I'm still talking to a lot more admission officers. I'm asking them the question, do people need to recalibrate and use the new numbers as they're trying to discern if they're at the median or not? And I'm hearing different answers. But so far, I've heard more people that have kind of said yes. They're really not that explicit in how they answer. They do it in a real circuitous way.
Wait, they say yes, use the new numbers?
But I mean, I'm hearing a lot of different things, and I really want to wait till I talk to a whole lot more people before I have a definitive opinion on this. But if I had to tell you what I've heard, the preponderance of what I've heard so far is that when you say look at the middle 50%, it's look at the middle 50% of what we're getting now, not what we used to get.
Okay.
So that does move the bar. Now I think Eric Furdo, I had him on the podcast. I think he would probably slightly disagree with that based on his answer to that question. He's one that had a slightly different answer. Like if you're close to the median, you might not want to raise the specter of, wow, did this person really bomb it? But so far, more people have said to me that, yeah, the new scores are the new bar, and use the new scores as your barometer of whether to submit or not. And so it's, in some ways, that could be another threat to the test because if you have to get this really high score even to make it worth it submitting, then bump that. Why do it? And then why put the time? Yeah. And especially if like you take a practice test and you're way off that, like if you're way off those scores, then like why even put the time in?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it seems like if it's going to just keep getting higher and higher. So eventually, almost no one will be able to achieve that score and they won't get any test scores. And I think it kind of works for the schools because they're always trying to show their test scores as being higher because that bumps them up in the rankings. But it kind of does, as you point out, create a dilemma for students to figure out where do my test scores fit in this scenario.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, I mean, even apart from rankings, it is one of the ways the families keep track. Is one of the measuring rods people use out here to discern, compare schools. They look at acceptance rate, they look at test scores, they look at rankings, they look at these kinds of things. It's a real dilemma, and I'm going to probably report back on this. I feel like I'd like to talk to at least 30 more people, and get more opinions on this before I say anything definitive. But so far, the sense that I have is the new scores are what you should be looking at and not the old scores, and the new scores are higher. Because what I do know about schools is they don't like their numbers to go down; they like them to go up. And so if you're going to be pulling down their averages, it means you usually need to be stronger than the average applicant in other areas of your application. So this one is a little bit of to be determined, but so far the evidence to me, it's not a big enough sample size, but it's the people I'm asking so far. It's funny. It's funny how they answer. Like, they just don't come out and say clearly, like, yes, use our new scores.
Mm-hmm.
I'll harken back to what I said recently in some bonus content we gave to our donors on this topic. Ask a school. And you can ask a school without telling them what your scores are. You can say, listen, this is the school that I attend. My parents, this is the parent education, that I've had. This is the major I'm interested in. This is my gender. This is my race. What scores do you recommend that I have to submit or not submit? Put it on the schools. And that's my advice for now. But from the preliminary data I have, the new higher scores are raising the bar and making it even harder to qualify to be a test submitter. All right, next.
Next is increase recruitment of transfers in community college.
Yeah, so, all of this sort of, if you look at it, most of these things flow from the same thing, which is colleges have, for all the colleges that are out there, obviously there's exceptions. They're the ones you read about all the time, but that's not the masses. They're seeing a decrease in applicants, and they're seeing a decrease of applicants who are either willing or able to pay. And so they're doing all kinds of things like launching online programs. But one of the things that's really hitting them is we've got to get more creative at going after I really could have called this going after the non-traditional student, right? An interesting thing about transfers is transfers have a much higher yield.
Yeah.
So for our first-time listeners, yield is the percentage of accepted students who choose to come. So if I'm in admissions and I put 100 offers on the street, if 50 come, then I have a 50% yield. If 80 come, I have an 80% yield. If 10 come, I have a 10% yield. And there are schools that have yields of 10 or even lower in some cases. So yield is everything. It's because that's how you have to plan when you're trying to meet your enrollment goals. And so when you go after transfers, you have a higher yield. The transfer yield is in the high 50s. Okay. And the regular yield is down to the low 30s. So that's gold to an admission office. Wow. I have almost a 6 in 10 chance of someone coming versus a 1 in 3. Also, well, I guess this partly explains the yield. They tend not to look at as many schools either. When I work with transfer students, they don't want to look at like 15 schools. They really don't. So they're looking at less schools, but that probably explains the yield. Community college for a long time has been seen as a gold mine, but most people didn't do it. Now, all of a sudden, it's pretty appealing. For one, the cost, you're looking usually at 2 years of cost. You have 2 years of college to look at how they did in a college environment. I feel like more and more of traditional 4-year schools are waking up to the gold mine of community colleges. Now, they've been a gold mine for a lot of public schools for a really, really long time, decades. But it's tended to go state by state. Like where you are, Lisa, they have a very, very great articulation agreement between community colleges and state schools, and they've built really natural pathways.
Right. And in Illinois, too, the same could be said.
Yeah, not in Georgia. So this is not a state that's set those pathways up. Florida's got a great system. California's got a great system. I think the rest of the country is starting to realize we need to do what North Carolina and Florida, Texas, and California, some of the states that have been leaders on this, because it's literally a gold mine of kids that has been really overlooked in a lot of states.
Right. And not only are they a gold mine financially, but I mean, they're talent for society that I think hasn't been being recruited and enhanced to its highest potential. And so, I think it's great that colleges of all private, public, all calibers are starting to look more to these students. They might not have had the best high school career, but they've, gone to community college. They've proven themselves. They're more mature. They have a better idea of what they want to do. And I mean, I think they're probably going to be more successful in a college environment after the community college experience, and so it's kind of win-win for everybody, I think.
Yeah. And one of the things I'm working on now is lining up an interview with a community college expert, and because we've never had that on here in 4 years, and this is some of the questions that I want to ask is the trends that they're seeing. But it needs to be elevated way, way, way more than it currently is. Something like 27% of all students are in community colleges. And so what a gold mine, what a treasure trove.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends Michael Ireland of Smith College and Courtney Hatch Blauvett continue answering questions about paying for college that you sent in. Listen and enjoy.
Well, we've got a number of net price calculator questions here, and I have one of my own, which I'm going to address to Courtney. I would point out that calculators are all over the place in terms of their quality. And I think like at Smith and Williams, you tend to have much more robust ones than some of the ones I see. They can be pretty flimsy at some schools. So that's also one of the challenges is that there's no sort of accepted standards across the industry, with these calculators. And I'm sure, Courtney, did you see well, actually, I don't know if you were at your schools when net price calculators came in 2011.
No, in Florida, I was, no, that was after Florida. So The only school I worked at that really used those was Williams. I'm just assuming we had one at the community college, but it was a much simpler calculation. And I would say I've told families, even though, as Michael mentioned, they don't want to hear this, that if you really want to have some assurance, then screenshot as you're filling these out, screenshot everything you're doing, and then screenshot your result, and then send it to the college financial aid and say, can you double check my inputs and tell me if this result is truly accurate? And if they would appreciate you doing that work for them. And the other thing I'll say is, I don't know what Smith says, but at Williams, they use the line, they might have changed this, I didn't check, but they used to use the line, if you have typical assets. And of course, families are like, well, what does that mean?
Sure.
And I would say it means you're not like sitting on a pile of investment money on the side beyond your retirement, or you're not sitting in like a $2 million home that's paid off. But there's also all these other issues that go into them especially about what the property rates everywhere are doing and rising, and how long someone has had their home, and how the college takes this is a whole road we could go down.
No, this is great. I want to come back to your screenshot point in another question it relates to, but this is the one question that I've thrown in here because, I'm a talker and I can't just help myself. I got to squeeze one in. So this is for you, Courtney. So I've had schools tell me that net price calculators tend to be inaccurate when someone owns their own business, or if a student's coming from a family with parents who are divorced, separated, or never married. Do you agree with that? And also, are there any other times that net price calculators are not reliable? And this actually throw it out to Courtney. You can start, and Michael, if you want to anything.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked this. And again, it's always a good idea to call each school and double check. Also, on the front page of most schools' net price calculators, there's a wall of text that nobody wants to read, but usually these issues are addressed if you take the time to read the small print. So this is also really dependent on what applications the schools use. So there's the FAFSA, which some schools only use the FAFSA, and then there's the CSS profile. So for all these situations, if it's a FAFSA only school, I'm pretty confident in saying the net price calculator would be pretty accurate, because those schools just don't go as much into depth in tax returns, and especially for people who are small business owners. And the FAFSA only requires, if in the case of divorce or separation, one parent, the custodial parent.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, the net price calculator should be pretty solid for those schools. However, for schools that use the CSS profile, that's where it gets trickier, because those schools are going to be going deeper into tax returns. So yeah, for self-employed families, I usually say it's not going to be accurate, and explain to the school that that's your situation, and see if they'll do a pre-read of some kind for you. For divorced or separated families, where almost all CSS profile schools require the custodial and the non-custodial parent, I want to shout out my undergrad Gettysburg College that does not require non-custodial parent information. But then you have to have each parent fill it out with their own information and then add it together. So if it's a case where there's not good communication, then that's a lot harder to do. And there's still some nuances that might shift. And for the last example I'll give of another population that I'm really passionate about working with, that I get to work with at Miss Hall's, is international families who need financial aid. So unfortunately, net price calculators really are useless for them. There's so many things about financial aid in the U.S. that are not relevant for international. And when I say that, I mean not non-U.S. citizens. If it's someone with dual citizenship of the U.S. and another country, they are counted as U.S. citizen. But for these families that are non-U.S. citizen, like the net price calculators won't work. They can ask for a pre-read, but a lot of schools probably won't do it. Almost every school except 5 that say they're need blind are not need blind for international families. So it's a whole population that there's so many exceptions and challenges that I wish there was more awareness of, but that's what I'll say about that.
Well, you gave a chance to, thanks for shouting that out. I really appreciate you adding that.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, if you want to know where we get our content for this podcast, well, we get it from you, our listeners, based on what you write in and you ask us to cover. But we also get it from experience. I'm on the front lines working with a range of modest income, average income, and high income families, and I listen to what they ask me. One thing I am being asked about a lot these days are what opportunities are available for my child at Canadian universities. And so our recommended resource for episode 203 will help you if you have curiosity about Canadian universities as well. It is Macleans. And Macleans is a famous magazine in Canada. It's been around for 115 years, started in 1905. Even when I was there, eons ago, I grew up knowing about Macleans. But it's their annual look at colleges and universities in Canada. And I'm going to give you the ticker really quickly, but you're probably not going to remember that. So you're going to need to go to the show notes. And so it's www.macleans.ca/hub/education-rankings/. I know it's a lot, and I'm not going to repeat it, but we'll put it in the show notes for you. In their recent annual college edition, they share results of a survey they had of over 19,000 Canadian students to see which universities in Canada students are the most happy at. And so they look at a number of things. They also talk to professors and staff, their residential life, opportunities for extracurricular activities, and experiential education through things such as co-ops. And students also chimed in addressing things like mental health services. Now, if you heard our episode we did on Canadian universities, a year and a half or so ago, you know that Canadian universities are divided into medical doctoral universities, comprehensive universities, and primarily undergraduate universities. So in this Macleans particular college edition, where they look at the survey of 19,000 people, they focus on 15 medical doctoral universities, 15 comprehensive universities, and 19 primarily undergraduate universities. And so there's some other information here as well that I think you'll find really interesting. I just wanted to highlight one of the things that you'll find on this. So it's a good reservoir of information to learn about Canadian colleges. We'll now return to my interview with Michael Ireland and Courtney Hatch-Blauvett on Paying for College. Questions and answers that you sent in. Anything you want to add to that, Michael? Would you agree that net price calculators tend not to be that accurate for international students, divorced, separated, never married, and business owners?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, they're all just complicated situations potentially. I mean, I think the net price calculator can work for divorced and separated families, but you've got to do a lot of additional work on your own. And so maybe you run the net price calculator twice, one for each household, and that's, you know, if the parents are not then remarried, which adds additional complexity because
Sure.
the schools take a very different approach for that. So yeah, it definitely gets complicated pretty quickly when parents are divorced or separated. And then, you know, and then I think as Courtney mentioned with businesses, that also doesn't do a great job. And primarily the reason for that is that for colleges that really take a close look at business income and business value, particularly colleges that require the CSS profile, they'll do things that we kind of describe as add backs, where we look at allowances that the IRS allows. It's like, oh, you can deduct depreciation or your car expense and things like that, whereas a college may still count that as income and not allow that reduction of your income for those kinds of things. So that's why they don't do quite as good a job when there's when a family owns their own business. So yeah, certainly things to watch for. The one other thing I'd say too, that one other area they fall down a little bit is if the family owns real estate other than their primary home, and same kind of thing where the IRS allows a number of deductions against that real estate, particularly if you're renting it out to someone and earning some income from that, and whereas colleges may not allow all of those deductions for that rental property.
Yeah, I experienced this, last year's class with a family, and when they ran the net price calculators, the numbers were coming at a certain point, and the student ended up applying ED to a very generous school. It was an Ivy. All the Ivies tend to have a lot of money. It's one of those no loans Ivies. And this child got in, and the school asked for 18,000 more than what the net price calculator said, and they tried appealing it, and they lost, and so that's a pretty big difference. But it was a business owner, and they own several businesses, and I think it's an example of what you're talking about there. So, all right, Michael, next question, and we still are in this net price calculator world here. So, our child intentionally applied to colleges that say they met full demonstrated need. We completed 7 net price calculators, and a few of the schools were more than double the best offer. I double checked my work, so I know we never made a mistake. How can offers vary so much for schools that claim they meet full demonstrated need?
Yeah. It's interesting how it's a great thing to do to look at different colleges and not a bad idea to look at ones that meet full need in for some students in some situations. And so I think there are a number of reasons that they could end up being different. So having having an awareness of, does that college have some kind of merit aid in addition to their need-based aid? Even if they meet full need, they could also have merit aid that they offer also. And so that can sometimes create differences between colleges. And so certainly, checking their website to see if that is the case. Also, if you're doing a net price calculator, you can sometimes begin to get an idea if a college does offer a merit-based financial aid just by the questions that they ask. Are they asking what my GPA is as a student, or my rank in class, or standardized test scores, those kinds of things that may indicate the college does offer some kind of merit aid. And then typically, if that's the case, they'll often give the results of the net price calculator and list merit aid and need-based aid separately many times. So certainly that's something to look at and sort of ask the question: was that a factor in this? The second piece that I would think about is, even once the college makes that determination of what a student or a family's financial need is, how are they're meeting that need with financial aid, and as many of us know, financial aid's it's a big tent, and so financial aid could include loans and work and grants also, and so really looking at what that college does to meet that need. And most colleges, it is work, loan, and then grant. And what are those numbers? What is their loan expectation? What is their work expectation? Because those numbers are going to vary by college, even the ones that meet full need. And then, in some cases, there's a lower loan expectation, for individual schools. And maybe it's the same each year, or maybe it changes, as a student moves along in their college experience. And then there are a handful of colleges that don't include loans as part of their financial aid award in meeting that financial need. So those are the kind of the two big areas I would imagine that a family could run into where they may see some differences in those determinations.
So this one's a bit of a head scratcher for me, because this was a question that was sent in, but it's also a family I'm working with. And so I've seen the numbers, and in none of the schools had a merit piece in there. And the loans wouldn't fully explain, differences between, one school, asking for 45 and another school asking for 21.
I can talk a little bit about it too from William's perspective.
Sure. Go ahead. Chime in. Mm-hmm.
Well, like I started going down the road before of like home value. So some schools, I'm going to forget my words here, but a school that uses the CSS profile and meets full need will want to know your home value, your mortgage, your monthly payment, and your overall what's left. And one way that this can change, because remember, everything is demonstrated need as determined by the college's own policies, and every college has slightly different policies. So some schools will use, they will cap home equity, which means they'll take, at Williams at the time I was there, it was 1.2 times your home equity that we would cap it at that and not count anything beyond that. And some schools might count everything and not cap it. Another thing I think Williams was trying to do was take into account the parent loans for their own education as not as an appeal situation, but as like, we're just automatically going to take that into consideration as not being part of your income. And a lot of schools can't afford to do that, even if they can afford to meet full need. Yeah, there's just like so many little behind the scenes details that colleges can play with. And colleges that are so similar in how they do can still, if they have the money to play with, then they will play with them and try to be a little more generous using those. Does that help?
Yeah, and I figured it had to be something in the asset category. And all that stuff you're talking about is assets, right? And whether it's home equity or other properties or other thing, it's how different schools calculate assets a little differently. Because I know in this case that it wasn't a merit issue. And it also, I mean, if you're working with the loans, you're working with federal loan limits. So it's not like one school's throwing in their own $20,000 private loan or something.
Right.
So I figure it had to be assets related, but is a little bit surprising because I'm not going to mention the names of the schools here, but if I mention to you off air, you'd probably be surprised at some of these. These are some very wealthy schools that are coming in double some of the other very wealthy schools. So thanks for that. I think it's helpful. I think, one of the takeaways is you got to do these calculators. Like, they may not be perfect, but they do shed light, on what you can expect within a certain realm, right?
Yeah.
And now it's time for our college spotlight of the week.
Friends, very excited to have Kevin Newton back. Those of you who are regular listeners know he was on our podcast several months ago giving us an overview of why so many Americans are going abroad. And I partner with him with my company, School Match for You. He handles all the international placement, and I do U.S. and Canada. And I was looking at the college spotlights that we have. We have like 94, 95. We only had 2 international. So I said, Kev, can you help us out? And he committed. He's going to do one every 3 months. Very excited. And Kev, why don't you tell us who you're going to talk about today and take it away?
Mark, thanks again for having me. I'm always glad to be here. But I think, when people think of going overseas, it's the same universities that immediately jump in their head. It's Oxford, Cambridge, St. Andrews, maybe London School of Economics or La Sorbonne in Paris. But I wanted to jump into one that I think is, in a lot of ways, their peer, but doesn't get quite the play, at least outside of certain circles, that it deserves. And that's University College London. Now, University College London is the oldest constituent college of the University of London, which, full disclosure, that's where my graduate degree is from. So I'm obviously a little biased towards the University of London as a whole. But what makes UCL so unique is, in a lot of ways, it kind of paved the way for the modern research university. It was founded in 1826 to be a university that was independent of the church. Remember that the Church of England was still very closely aligned with Oxford and Cambridge at this time, and the church in Scotland had ties to St. Andrews and other of the ancient universities there. So the idea that a university was independent of the church was a pretty big idea in the 19th century. And we see this at other universities that pop up across Europe. If you see the word free in front of a university in, say, Belgium or the Netherlands, for example, it's not always referring to the tuition, but the fact that it's independent of the church or of the state. Now, what makes UCL so unique is that they're good at just about everything they do, which a lot of universities want to say that, but UCL really backs it up. According to some international rankings, they're the 8th best in the world. And I wanted to highlight a few other rankings. In law, which again, law and medicine you can study as an undergrad, they're the 6th best in the UK. In medicine, they're the 9th best in the UK. But what really stands out is they're the best medical school for clinical medicine in the world outside of North America. So while law and medicine as undergrads is a discussion for another day, anyone who's looking at studying one of those should, at the very least, consider UCL. But again, what kills me is just how good they are at everything. They have an amazing business school. They have an amazing everything. Their scientific faculties are superb. And even as someone who admittedly prefers things that are a bit off the beaten track. I think I mentioned last time my master's degree is in Islamic and Chinese law, which is a strange thing for someone from the American South to specialize in. Their Egyptology department is world leading. So, and additionally, their School of Slavic and Eastern European Studies is phenomenal. And you can study languages from Albanian and Bulgarian to Slovak and Slovenian there. So if that's your thing, this is a place that you need to be looking at.
Let me ask you a quick question, Kev, because I saw as well that they're ranked 8th in the world with the QS World Rankings, which a lot of people don't know this, but outside of the U.S., that's like considered the most reputable rankings. And our regular listeners know my view on rankings. My view on rankings is that if you're ranked very high by a reputable organization, then you are a very good school. However, that does not mean they're a good match for you, right?
Right.
If you're the kind of person that would die in a city or die a certain distance from home or with a certain size student body, or we could go on and on with, maybe a school not as strong in a certain major. So that's my view on ranking. So it does test, especially when it's a credible organization. There's a certain aspect that does say that they are a very, very good school. Now you have to figure out if they're a match for you. Now, why do you think they fly under the radar?
I think a lot of it is the fact that they're not Oxford and Cambridge. And some of it, too, is the fact that the nomenclature is a little confusing because University College London, it's easy to get that confused with the University of London. And suddenly you're looking at places like Goldsmiths or Birkbeck, or even depending on how close of an affiliation you're looking at, the London School of Economics or SOAS, where I did my graduate degree. It's a pretty loose confederation. It's almost better to think of the University of London as more like the University of California system. So, there are a lot of different campuses that are quite different. Now, to kind of get into the specifics about UCL, first of all, there is the elephant in the room, and that is that it is in central London. So while central London is not exactly the same as, say, lower Manhattan, it's still a big city. It's a city of almost 8 million people. Mm-hmm. And if you're looking, I like to, for your listeners who are familiar with the different universities in, say, Washington, D.C., it's going to feel a little bit more like a George Washington than it is an American or a Catholic. There's not so much a central campus. Now, at the same time, it's not quite as extreme as George Washington, which feels like city blocks. There are certainly some stately academic buildings. There are some green spaces. But at the same time, the university did not appear before the city did. London's 2,000-year-old city, UCL, will be celebrating its 200th anniversary here in a few years. So there is that idea that it's not a central campus with a 4-foot wall around it or anything like that.
I want to go back to something you said. I intuitively got it when you said there can be confusion with University of London. If you ever want to play a good joke on a UPenn graduate, they introduce yourself, go to UPenn, you can be like Nittany Lions, and because they get that all the time, the confusion with Penn State, and you can also do that with Michigan State and Michigan too. Meet a Michigan alum and say Spartan Power. It's just if you can do it with a straight face, it's hilarious. And so that makes some sense to me that there would be confusion because the names do sound very similar, especially if you're not from over there and not familiar with them.
I will try that with my friends who went to Penn, but I'm married to someone who's a massive Michigan fan, and that would be a quick way to be sleeping on the couch. So I don't think I'm going to do that.
Yeah, leave that one
especially
alone.
Since that was their one loss this year.
Of course, and I'm a Spartan alum.
I knew that. So
Yeah.
we won't tell my wife that, at least this year.
Hey, you got the last laugh.
Well, so far, we'll see about that.
Right.
Probably by the time this
you're
ends.
up against Georgia.
But the other thing is that UCL is not a small campus with regards to its student body. There are approximately 20,000 undergrads here and another 24,000 or so grad students. So additionally, that's also something weird, is that instead of being a university that is mostly undergrads, it's definitely more skewed towards the grad students. Now, again, depending on your department, that may not be such a bad thing. If you're more interested in something where you want the opportunity to study something at a more graduate level or get those research opportunities, the fact that your faculty is already specializing in that helps stand out. And again, given the way that it works overseas, your lectures are still going to be taught by faculty. It's not going to be nearly as many TAs as some universities would have here in the US, especially for lower division courses. The trade-off of that is, of course, when you go to office hours, you're just as likely to see a TA as you are a professor, depending on the course. If it's an endowed university professor who is constantly speaking in front of the House of Commons, for example, they're going to be a little less accessible than someone who's more junior on faculty. But generally speaking, you'd be surprised how, if you make the effort, how easy it is to form those bonds with professors, especially even at a place like UCL.
I really appreciate you using that GW, Georgetown American Catholic example. I think that's helpful. I think a lot of our listeners know that. If they're not familiar with it, they're familiar with other schools that have clearly defined boundaries and a sense of campus that's distinct from the surrounding city, versus one that's just interspersed, throughout the city. And I think that's helpful for the visual. What are the things that they look for in an applicant?
Like most UK universities, the most important thing is your performance in specific subjects. And the way that they measure this is through AP or IB tests. Now, some departments will give some leeway to dual enrollment. And with the pandemic, everything's kind of been thrown up in the air. But the most important thing, as a general rule abroad, but especially for UK universities, is your performance on AP and IB exams. And we'll use AP exams just because most people I work with are presenting with AP exams. But if you could and also the university is very clear about its IB requirements, whereas the AP requires a bit more digging. So I think that would be the greater value. So just as a brief background on what you do as a secondary student in the UK is you whittle down your courses to 3 or 4 A levels that you study for a period of about 2 years. And you take a test at the end of it to see how well you've mastered it. And again, a great way to think about these are AP exams. And that's the closest cognate we really have to here in the US. So a typical student may present with further mathematics, which is a little bit more advanced than Calculus BC, but they accept Calculus BC because that's the best we've got here in the US. For a place like UCL, they do have, outside of Cambridge, some of the toughest admissions requirements in that they do want to see a number of 5s. But what I've noticed in comparison to places that only take 3 5s, UCL wants 5 scores, and we'll get into what they need to be here in a moment, is that whereas other groups want Group A subjects, which are those subjects that you've studied for at least a year, that give you at least a year's worth of credit. So AP Biology, AP Calculus, AP US History, instead of, say, AP Statistics or AP Government or something like that, is that as long as there's a good mix, they're a little less strict about that. So, you're not going to get in necessarily with some of the AP classes or AP tests that are perceived as easier. So if you come to them with AP Microeconomics, AP Macroeconomics, AP Comparative Government, AP US Government, and AP Statistics, that's not going to be viewed as well as someone who's coming to them with AP Calculus BC, AP US History, AP European History, AP English Literature, and say AP German Language. It's just...
And would physics and chem and bio be in the respected categories?
Yes. So all the physics classes plus AP Chem and AP Bio are considered those year-long courses, even though Physics C, Mechanics, and Physics E&M are typically taught as semester courses. Mm-hmm. The outliers there are AP Environmental Science and AP Computer Science. And that last one really throws a lot of people that some universities don't have a lot of respect for AP Computer Science. We're starting to see that change, but computer science overseas, as it is here, is one of the most competitive majors. So the best advice, and this probably bears repeating on future episodes as well, is if you're interested in if you're interested in computer science overseas, make sure you have Calculus BC, because that's what's going to help you stand apart. But Anyway, back to UCL. Depending on what you want to study, the requirements are different. So someone who wants to study medicine, for example, those 5 AP classes need to have 5s because that is an extraordinarily competitive program. And it's not just enough to have the 5s. You also need to have the 5s in relevant subjects. So they're going to definitely want to see chemistry. They're going to want to see biology and calculus BC. Now, those other 2 can be something a little less scientific, but still something that's challenging. So a language, a literature, or a history class would be my recommendation. If you want to study law, you need to have an English class, a history class, and some relevant combination thereof. Now, as you move down the less competitive degree options, so say by the time you get to, say, history, for example. And again, I feel like I do this because I did a dual major in history and Arabic, so I can make fun of history.
You can. You're the history nerd.
I can do it and not feel bad about it. It may be, depending on the year, 2 4s and 3 5s, or 1 4 and 4 5s. So again, UCL is one of the most competitive universities in the UK. And these are the minimum requirements. You're still going to need a strong personal statement and a strong recommendation. But here's the thing. Once you meet those requirements, the acceptance rate's pretty darn high. So depending, certain subjects, law, medicine, computer science, those have extraordinarily competitive admissions rates. But others, not so much. One of the newer ones, and this data is a couple of years old simply because the way that some admissions rates work, you have to do a freedom of information request. So I'm still waiting for the latest information. And as the non-UK citizen, it can be a little hard to come to write to my my non-existent member of parliament and request. But for a degree that, I think a lot of people would be very interested in, and that's the liberal arts and sciences degree, it's 1 out of 3, which again sounds really competitive. But something I always like to compare that to is Harvard accepted 4%, Yale accepted 6%. So again, it is sort of comparing apples and oranges, but if you're already at this level where you're looking at elite universities, and maybe you don't think UCL is right for you, or Oxford or Cambridge are right for you, and there are a lot of reasons they're not right for everyone. And maybe you think St. Andrews is an hour away from civilization and therefore not right for you. If you want to be in the middle of it all, then a place like UCL could very well be it.
So, Kevin, I have a question for you, because I think a lot of our listeners are probably thinking this, and it's a pretty big difference between how admissions works, the UK versus over here. So, and you're probably familiar with this, but students take AP exams in May, and then they get their scores back a couple months later, July-ish. And so the scores only come into play in admissions in the U.S. for students that took these courses in the sophomore or the junior year.
Right.
Because the timeline doesn't work for the senior year. And so is it the exact same over there? And students would need to get these 5 5s in these classes and do that in 10th and 11th?
Not at all.
And 12th is not even okay. So talk about that, because that's a pretty significant difference, because over here, a lot of times you're going to be taking those classes, the BC calcs and physics Cs and all of them. That a lot of those times, those are going to be 12th grade classes.
Right. So first of all, let me say it is to your advantage to go ahead and get at least some AP classes out of the way. And simply because what they're working off of is your past performance. And the way they know this, when you only have one letter of recommendation, by the way, and you send a link to the person who's writing your letter of recommendation, and this is something you should prepare them for, is that they copy and paste their letter in. But at the top of it, it'll have the AP courses that you're scheduled to take in the coming term. And they need to put your predicted scores in. So what the teacher feels that you will do. Now, it's kind of an open secret. Everyone overestimates on this. UCAS, the University and College Admissions Service, estimated that upwards of 40% of individual scores reported are overestimated. So if your teacher is thinking you're going to be between a 4 and a 5, it's better for them to give you the benefit of the doubt and put that you're getting a 5. Now, obviously, your English teacher, if they're writing your letter of recommendation, may not know what your biology score is going to be or your physics score. So there are a couple of great ways to do this. The most professional way is for them to simply email your relevant teacher and ask them. Alternatively, go off your previous year classes. A lot of students are not going to jump into an AP class without having taken at least something similar. Now, a lot of places don't offer honors European history, and then the next year you take AP European history. Obviously not. But if you've gotten A's in history classes and are still performing well, and your school has a track record of producing 4s and 5s, it's a safe bet you're going to get a 5. At least safe enough to feel honest about it on UCAS. Again, it's one of those things that you're not going to be penalized because the teacher's the one putting these in. But the teacher is encouraged to overestimate. And again, this is part of the official guidance simply because you do get a conditional acceptance. How this works from this point is they've looked at this and they've said your teacher feels confident you're going to get this. And what the university will do is if you've already got the relevant AP scores from your sophomore or junior year, they may go ahead and offer an unconditional acceptance. If not, they'll offer a conditional acceptance, and it'll spell out in the letter that you're in as long as you get these AP scores, or as long as you get this ACT or SAT score, or sometimes as long as you graduate. So whatever the requirements are, you'll have to meet those. 85% of the time, if you don't meet those requirements, you don't get in. However, even among elite UK universities, not so much Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, St. Andrews, because they're getting plenty of international applicants. But certainly those places that may not see all these international applicants, so that starts with UCL, King's College, the University of Edinburgh, the University of Durham, etc. If you've made it clear, dare I say, demonstrated interest, like we do here in the US, there's some fudge room, shall we say. Now, if you get straight 2s, they're not going to let you in because they don't want you to come in and fail out. It's nothing personal. You jump in at a higher level. You're not taking introduction to biology if you're a biology major. They assume that you already know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, for example.
Friends, this ends part 1 of this 2-part spotlight on UCL. We hope you will join us next week for the final part with Kevin Newton.
Next week in the news, a new rush to create a 3-year degree option by Emma Whitford at the Wall Street Journal. That's part 2 of 2. Mark will be discussing what changes do you foresee in college admissions over the next few years. That'll be part 4 of 4. Our interview is with Michael Ireland, the Assistant Director of Financial Aid at Smith College, and Courtney Blauvett, a former financial aid officer at 4 colleges and Director of College Counseling at the Miss Hall School, answering 12 questions our listeners sent in about financial aid and paying for college. That's part 4 of 5. And our college spotlight is part 2 of 2 from Kevin Newton on the University College London.
And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please subscribe so you get every episode as soon as it is released. If you are interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on your favorite podcast listening app. I am the producer of the Your College Bound Kid podcast. We have a fantastic team of 9 people. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. David Williams and Dr. Lisa Ruff. Our sound engineer who fixes all of our many errors is Nemanja Motvich. The amazing music you hear is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Dalianas Dimitri. If you want to have a college coaching session with me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want to ask, or a college you want Lisa or me to do a spotlight on, or if you have a recommended resource or an article you think we should share, Just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. By the way, check out our website where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you, our family, next week.